Hi, I'm Paul Verschoor, and together with my colleague Jana Bednar, we're speaking with Naina Agrawal-Hardin about collaboration in grassroots protest organizations. Naina is a political and partnership strategist with the Sunrise Movement and Know Your Nine, and a freshman at Yale University. So, welcome. This is Paul Verschoor with my colleague Jana Bednar for the Convergent Science Network podcast in collaboration with Ernst Struman Forum. And today we're with Naina Agrawal-Hardin. Welcome, Nina.
Thank you.
So, Nina, how we always start our discussions is just with the person we're speaking to give a short description about their trajectory that brought them where they are now in really the middle of a complex collaborative process called the Sunrise Movement.
And I would be happy to do that. So for anyone who is unfamiliar with Sunrise, the US-based and youth-led movement and organization whose mandate is essentially to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. Sunrise is responsible partially for pushing ideas like the Green New Deal into the mainstream here in the United States, and currently is working on co-governing with the Biden administration as we sort of enter this era of climate action in America. As for my personal trajectory, my dad's family has its roots in rural northern India, in Bihar, and my mom's parents have a home in rural Appalachia in East Tennessee, nestled in the Great Smoky Mountains. And both of these places growing up have been places that have been vulnerable to climate disaster and where I've seen challenges like chronic poverty and also social inequalities exacerbate the difficulty of recovering after climate disaster strikes. So that's sort of the way the climate crisis showed up for me growing up. And when I found Sunrise, what excited me about the movement was that it was a collaboration between people from, sort of frontline communities and people from just very different organizing backgrounds as well. So people from anti-fossil fuel infrastructure fights, people from campus divestment fights, people from financial sector divestment fights, people who had been working on lobbying and politics for a long time, and so the sort of combination of the regional diversity and the relative racial, socioeconomic, and social diversity as compared to other parts of the climate movement, and then that diversity of experience is really what drew me to Sunrise.
So with that, now you described a little bit the Sunrise Movement as a movement and how you discovered that movement, but you're also active in the Sunrise Movement as a political and partnership strategist, it says. So how did you end up in that role?
Yeah, so I started out organizing locally with the Sunrise Movement in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is where my parents and I are based and where I just graduated high school. And gradually, as this 2019 global climate strike movement, which was an international collaboration, got underway, I began to represent Sunrise in the national coalition of youth-led organizations that was working on planning and executing that strike mobilization at the national level in the United States. And I was asked to assume that role in part because I was a high schooler, in part because I have, strong roots both in the United States and internationally, and in part because I had been organizing with Sunrise for some time then and had a good sense of the movement's sort of core mission and how to advocate for that mission in this coalition space. And so I sat on that coalition representing Sunrise with a friend of mine, a colleague, for about a year. And when it became clear that mass in-person mobilization wasn't going to be possible for a while because of COVID-19, I sort of started to do other political and partnerships work for the movement. And so particularly looking at our partnerships with Gen Z and high school-led organizations and also looking at how we make our political communication accessible to that age group, that demographic.
But if you speak of the Sunrise Movement, so before we delve into the specifics of collaboration, what should we think of? What's the scale of this organization? How is it really organized?
Yeah, Sunrise has, I think, now over 500 what we call hubs across the United States of America. And these hubs can range in membership. They can have anywhere from 3 members to 30 or 63, or even some have 300 members engaged. So they really vary in terms of their size, but they organize under a common set of principles, and often they're working together or working on a campaign that the national movement leadership has helped to design. So Sunrise, the organization, as we call it, is a set of national staff members who work full or part-time on setting up support resources and devising strategic campaigns for hubs to use as needed. And hubs are also encouraged to create their own strategic goals that are applicable in their local context, and they kind of can choose where to put their energies in that way. In terms of other work that the national organization does, as of late, we've done a lot of work with the Biden administration. Our executive director was on President Biden's task force for climate policy, unity and climate policy, when he was running in the lead up to the general election, and really helped to craft some of that policy, which was wonderful. And so now we're sort of working on enacting that.
Clear. So, okay. So now, how would you define, also within the Sunrise Move, how would you define collaboration? What is it, and what is it good for?
Well, I remember I was at a Sunrise training a year and a half ago, and there was a module on power. And we had this classic discussion of the distinction between power over and power with. And so I think in the context of Sunrise, I would define collaboration as an effort to build power with other young people towards a common goal, in order to win a common goal. And that common goal is Green New Deal legislation, and is, a mass mobilization to combat the climate crisis in a way that is in line with what science and justice demand. So that's how I would define it, as young people working to build power with each other towards that goal.
Mm-hmm. But then, if we want to build power with, then of course you have to shape that, right? You have to build your organization. You have to engage people and bring them in. So what are the real steps you would take there? What's the method then to build power with, also in your experience?
Well, Sunrise's theory of change can really be broken down into 2 pieces. One of those pieces, and we teach this in almost all of our introductory trainings, and this is really something we disseminate to as many people as we can within the Movements Network. So the theory of change is 2 pieces. First is people power. And by people power, we mean sort of 2 things. The first is mass mobilization, but the second is and direct action and protest. But the other is actually just talking to our communities. That's really, I think, core to what Sunrise does. And trying to relate to people who may not already be engaged in the movement on a personal level through our personal stories, or through, narratives that are anchored in the places that we care about, whether you're in a hub or whether you're on the national staff. So that's the first, is sort of building people power and absorbing new people into the movement, and then activating existing members to take action, protest, or contact government representatives or whatever else might make sense at that moment, but getting them energized to do that. And then the second is political power. And, when Sunrise was founded the basic idea beyond that political power piece was to get fossil fuel money out of our elections as much as possible, and to vote out leaders who are beholden to the interests of fossil fuel executives, and instead vote in leaders who are aligned with the movement. And the theory of change is that, with those two pieces combined, you can really change the government agenda, the dominant government agenda in the places we call home, and win the legislation we want to tackle the climate crisis. But those are the two pieces, people power, political power, that we talk about.
But do you see them as independent pieces, or do you see them as interlinked?
Very interlinked. Sunrise absolutely believes that our political leaders are responsive to mass protest and to, popular action and popular ideas. And certainly, if you're able to activate young people at the voting block, then that's going to be helpful when it comes to building political power. And certainly, if your mainstream political leaders are talking about your movement's ideas, more people are going to get involved. So they're very connected.
Mm-hmm. Because now, we should bring in the fact that most of your membership is too young to vote. Is that right?
Yeah. I don't know if it's most, but it is a significant chunk. Yeah.
Yeah. And so keeping in line with what Paul has been asking you, so what is it that, you must have been 15 or 16 when you started working with this movement. So what was your power? What was it that you could do? Because you couldn't do anything at the ballot box.
Yeah. So you mean, what is it about working with Sunrise that was empowering to me, or?
No, although I'm sure a lot. But so what is it, since you can't yet vote, are you trying to reach those who can vote? Are you trying to build up some sense of purpose among young people who then, once they can vote, will express that? And so it's kind of like a promissory action in the future. And through that, it's going to influence politicians. Or is it through the protests that you think, for those who can't yet vote, is that where their real power is?
I see. I think the answer is sort of yes to all of the above. So Sunrise has done a lot of voter registration work and a lot of work to turn out young people at the polls and turn out people who are concerned about the issue of climate change. I think absolutely, peaceful, nonviolent protest, moral protest holds a lot of power. And Sunrise often looks to examples of that kind of protest from the past, like the civil rights movement, for inspiration. And it's particularly inspired, actually, but I think by these past examples of collaboration. Personally, I've done a lot of independent study of the ways in which civil rights leaders collaborated with each other in order to, win legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so I think, yes, absolutely, as someone who can't vote, being able to show up in that way has been critical. And and I think, also it is about helping young people develop a political consciousness even before they can vote, and combating sort of climate anxiety and a really pessimistic or even fatalistic view of the future that many, many young people are starting to develop because of the climate crisis, by saying, hey, look, it also presents an opportunity to build something better if we can work together well enough to make that happen. So to all of the things you said, I think, I've felt power come from all three of those sources.
But now, Nina, so what you emphasize a lot now in your analysis is this very central concept of power, right? Power over, power with. Now, that's not necessarily a straight line, right? Because in some sense, by developing power with your membership, you do try to develop power over, right, the opponents that you face from the fossil fuel industry, for instance, and their associated politician. right? So how do you balance that? Because whether you like it or not, and whether you find power with your overarching value, through that, you try to exert power over, right? So how do you balance that?
Such a good question. And one that I remember sort of grappling with that day at that training I mentioned, where that idea was introduced. I think, one of the things about being in a movement setting with people who share your values is that you're trusting each other to hold each other accountable to the goals of the movement and the values of the movement. And I think that's what makes it less intimidating to have power over anyone, even if those people are, corporate executives and wealthy politicians who historically have held a lot of the power in our society. And yeah, I would say for me personally, the idea that, the people who I work with are fundamentally want the same things I want for the same or similar reasons that I want them, right? Want a society that works for everyone, that takes care of everyone, that is more equitable and that has a sustainable future. Makes me much more comfortable with the idea of power over, because it makes me feel like if we overstep our bounds, or if we do something that exists outside of those values, then we can correct that because we're working together. Yeah, I'm not sure if that entirely answers your question. Feel free to ask a follow-up.
Well, okay, so you feel that the movement is self-correcting, right? But so there are a number of issues that then crop up that I find that are interesting follow-ups here, because then I could say, well, but by exerting power over, you also set up a dialectic that helps you to build your power with, because now you pointed out an enemy. And say it's us against, right? So it's not us for, it is us against. So in that sense, the power over is almost a necessary ingredient to then build your power with. And that would then, of course, the power with also make it intrinsically possibly unstable. Or do you think my interpretation is unnecessarily negative and cynical about that?
No, I think it's a really interesting point. And I think, I would push back slightly on, or I would add, I guess, to this idea of pointing out an enemy, because I think Sunrise from the very beginning has been very intentional about, yes, naming a few wealthy executives as an obstacle to the world we want to build, but it's actually always been much more about the world we want to build. I think, with, for example, the storytelling and public narrative that Sunrise incorporates into its work, it's never really about this person or this demographic has wronged me or wronged my community, and now it's time to take back the power or exact revenge. It's always about, this is what I envision my community looking like if we could pass this legislation, or if we could begin to think about this in a different way. And whether that's about sustainable, locally grown, fresh produce accessible to everyone, or clean water coming out of the tap no matter what zip code you live in, or, et cetera, et cetera. But it's very much about this vision for a better world. It's at least in my eyes, it's been much less about antagonizing, corporate executives, and instead has been about, being candid about what the obstacles are, but not dwelling on who's responsible and how we punish them. So I guess I would want to make that clear. But I think you're right that inherently there is some component of the work that is about building power over those who have historically held power.
Right. But then we can now switch the objective from going from the power over and against to the power for. As you were describing some elements, what you are for, and that would defend an end goal that you would see. Right? That would mean also a world where something like a Green New Deal has been realized. So what does that world look like that you would then be for as a sunrise movement?
Hmm. I can sort of anchor it in the places I'm familiar with, I think, a little bit. So, in the state of Michigan, for example, where I've grown up, I would want to see indigenous populations regain control of, much of the land and water and natural resources here, and resume a rightful role as stewards of, this place. I would want to see public education funded much more equally across racial and socioeconomic divides. And I would want to see our public education include case-based education about this state and its natural resources, its environment, and how we can properly take care of it. I, of course, would want to never see something like the Flint water crisis happen again. I would want to see Detroit residents be taken care of and not be bankrupted if their homes flood because of, excessive precipitation or other climate related disasters. The list goes on and on and on and on, right? I would want to see some of the most polluted zip codes cleaned up. Similarly, in somewhere like Appalachia, where my mom's parents have a home, I, again, would want to see Indigenous people regain a lot of control of the land and resources there. I would want to see, some alleviation of the chronic poverty there, and certainly some investment in better infrastructure, and the list goes on. But I think it boils down to a society in which we take care of the land and the environment, and we are taken care of also by our neighbors and by our government.
Mm-hmm. So is that program defined somewhere for the Sunrise Movement? There's a statement on that outlook?
I would say the Green New Deal resolution lays out a lot of that. And then also the organizing principles I mentioned earlier.
But this is fascinating because it's such a complex platform or vision. And it was interesting to listen to you, Naina, as you were describing it, because you switched and you said, I would like to see. So how is it within your organization? And we should also talk about different scales, right? Because the organization operates at a local scale. You said, I think you referred to the cells as hubs. Is that right?
Yeah.
And at a national scale. So how, at either one of those scales, how does the organization form a vision, its goals? What is that process like?
Such a wonderful question. So each hub, or many hubs, have distinct processes for, developing things like demands if they're going to, hold a nonviolent action, or if they're going into a meeting with a local politician, or whatever the occasion may be. And so some of those processes involve the entire hub membership getting together virtually or in person, and going through some kind of process where everyone talks about what's important to them to get out of the meeting, get out of the action, or have accomplished a year from that point. And then they sort of work together over time to develop a list of demands, or a broader vision for what how they want to transform the place where they're anchored.
Does the hub need to clear this with the national office?
Absolutely not. As long as it exists within the organizing principles, which I would be happy to share later on. But essentially, they say we are nonviolent in word and deed, and talk a bit about being inclusive in the movement, of all kinds of different backgrounds. Then they're fine. They can do, and they should do, whatever makes sense to the national organization. At least in a perfect world, it does not presume to know more about a local context than the people who live there. So hubs do not have to get permission from nationals. So again, some processes at the local level have everyone involved. Some processes have are spearheaded by what we call a hub coordinator, who's sort of responsible for overseeing the function of the hub. Others are spearheaded by maybe a hub political director. Each hub sort of structures itself differently, and that's fine. And many hubs, are connected online via Slack workspace or some other way, social media often, and will share documents or insights or get on the phone. Two leaders will get on the phone with each other and say, this is what worked for us when we were developing our vision or our demands. This is the process we used. You're a similarly sized hub. You have a similar, local context. Maybe we both organize in very conservative areas, or maybe we're both in big cities. Whatever the through line may be, hubs will sort of share wisdom and share expertise when possible, which is really cool. So yeah, they're sort of on the local level, and then at the national level, obviously, again, people are bound together by this shared theory of change I mentioned earlier, and by this set of principles that we organize under. At the national level, I think, one of the difficult and one of the great things about Sunrise is that decision making and visioning processes change pretty regularly based on what the staff of the organization has identified as strengths and weaknesses in our approach. But it is almost always collaborative, and whether that collaboration looks like, one or two people drafting a document and then many people giving feedback and revising and honing, whether it looks like, a series of 6 meetings where people are getting together to share thoughts, feelings, emotions, hopes, fears about what comes next for the movement or what comes next for the country, and then putting that into a shared action plan. Really, the list goes on and on and on of ways that process can unfold, but it is both locally and nationally, I think, almost always a collaborative one.
But Nina, what I find interesting is that you're saying almost always collaborative. So when is it then not collaborative, and why not?
I think there are probably instances where, because of group dynamics, often at the local level, I would say nationally, because people are employed, there's a little bit more structure to the collaboration. But locally, I think it's possible that, for example, a small hub of, say, 5 people, 4 of them start to get burnt out, and then one of them is sort of calling shots and organizing on their own. Or similarly, sometimes maybe one person has a lot more experience or a lot more confidence than everyone else in the group. And until the group dynamic can sort of accommodate that, and the other 4, however many there are, can, sort of see that their contributions are also valued, that one person is still sort of, collaborating in name, but not in practice. And I think that's pretty rare. Like, I think generally things work as they're supposed to, but it's always a possibility, and I think it does happen.
What you're pointing to, Nina, here, and which is always very difficult to regulate, is how do you resolve conflict, right? So you have your nodes, you have a dynamic inside nodes, you have a dynamic within nodes, and then in some hierarchical relation to a central node. So how do you deal with conflict in the end? Is that formalized in some way? Do you have a process for that, even to identify conflict?
Well, at the local level, I have seen hubs share wisdom and knowledge on this topic as well. So, if a hub is having conflict over whether it makes sense in their local context to engage in mutual aid or whether they should stick to legislative work, they might reach out to another hub who's had that same debate and say, how did you guide your discussion? How did you, which is interesting, right? Like, when collaboration is difficult within the hub, collaboration with another hub can come in and sort of help resolve that, which is fascinating to me. And I think, if there's in interpersonal conflict, like, someone has committed harm against another hub member, Sunrise National does have human resources and hired personnel who can help with that, and the local members have access to those people should they want that kind of help or that kind of intervention. So it sort of depends if the conflict is like about members clashing or injustice that has happened, or if it's about the ideas themselves or the mission itself. At the national level, I would say that the process for dealing with conflict has evolved and changed many times over the years as well. And in general, we've, worked and are continuing to work towards a culture that's not conflict avoidant, but rather can respond to conflict in a way that's productive for everyone involved. And that's, much easier said than done, but it's definitely a goal I've seen people talk about very openly. And again, we have, it is an organization. It is a 501c3 with a 501c4 arm. So, we have human resources and we have staff members whose job it is to help resolve conflict within the movement. And we also have many task forces, committees, and sort of teams who are addressing these big conflicts that are not interpersonal, but are about where is the future of the movement going? How do we ensure that Black people, for example, are at the forefront of where our movement is headed, and are listened to and respected where our movement is right now, for example. Like, that's been a big thing we've worked on over the past year and a half, 2 years. And there have been many teams that have arisen internally to collaborate towards answering some of those questions. But again, I wish I could give like this is the process, and the truth is that it changes all the time based on feedback.
So you're talking a lot about structure, and we're getting a clear sense that this is a very decentralized organization, where so much is happening within the hubs that have a lot of autonomy, right? And you've talked about how the movement has used that decentralization as a strength, that it's been able to define goals locally because, as you said, the national national organization says, no, you at the local level, the ground game much better than we do. That's fantastic. And then also the sharing of information from one hub to another. What are the downsides of this radical decentralization of the movement?
Well, for one, there is, of course, tension sometimes between our local hubs and our national organization. I myself have, been a local organizer at moments where there's a lot of work, a lot of motion sort of happening in the national organization, and it can get overwhelming, hard to stay caught up to date if the communication isn't, crystal clear. And these are humans at the end of the day, right? Like, who are staffing the national organization and trying, doing their best. But of course, sometimes it doesn't, it falls short of where it needs to be. So yeah, it can get overwhelming, it can get confusing, or it can feel too directive at times, or it can feel not supportive enough at times, right? Like, for example, I think, some of our national leaders are frequently meeting with, at this point, with, people from the Biden administration. And how do you maintain security and privacy and discretion, but also communicate candidly about complex policy dilemmas to a network of 500 plus local hubs, and without also seeming, like you at the top of the national organization, are somehow better or more important than a local organizer, right? Like, that's a really hard question. And back to this idea of power, like how is some of our proximity to power, how does that translate to all of us building more power instead of fighting with each other? I think Sunrise does a good job of that, but it's of course a challenge to overcome. And so I would say a drawback or a challenge is that the tension that can arise between local grassroots organizers and national staff when there's a disconnect in communication, or an imbalance of it either being too directive or not directive enough from the national org.
For sure. What about even just because you have some principles, some guiding principles, and probably, even though it's a very complex vision, for sure, when the national organization is consulting with the Biden administration, there is a clearer platform that they're in a vision that they're proposing. To what extent do you think that the decentralization is a hindrance to making progress toward some bigger goals?
Well, I would say on balance, it's much more of an asset. Like, I think that the fact of having this huge decentralized movement, who by and large care about the same things, backing, various movement leaders as they go into these meetings in the halls of power, is much more of an asset than anything else. But I would say, we have to be really intentional about how we create strategy. And there have been times in the movement's history where local and grassroots organizers have stood up and said, we had no hand, or we did not have an adequate hand in creating this, strategy that our movement is now posting about on its social media and is now organizing national mobilizations around, and that's not okay. And then the processes have had to be refined. And so, sometimes national staff members will hold a role that's entirely about scheduling, facilitating, and documenting calls with grassroots leaders that are open to anyone, where, questions are asked or feedback is given on an upcoming campaign proposal, or just, where sort of there's an exchange of ideas in the early stages of crafting the next phase of strategy. So that has helped. But again, we have to engage in that before we do engage in that before we move on the scale of federal policymaking or co-governance. And so I don't think that's a drawback either. I think it's probably also a value, but it takes time, and it takes a lot of energy, and it doesn't always go the way you want it to the first time, and that can be hard. And I also think, and I actually haven't seen so many instances of problems like this, but during my time at Sunrise, but I can imagine scenarios in which, and I'm sure there have been scenarios in which someone on our national political team is having a complex and sort of precarious conversation with a congressperson, and then that hub targets that congressperson or one of their close allies, and then that interferes with that national negotiation, right? And so there's always that possibility because hubs have so much autonomy.
How do you respond? How's the organization respond when you have this kind of problem like that?
I mean, honestly, you would probably have to ask a political staff person for an example, from their actual work, because it's never happened to me. But I will say, I think a lot of times we lean on relationships. So, ideally our, quote unquote, highest level or highest rank, which I'm loath to even use those terms, but ideally those staff people of the national organization have significant relationships with members of our strongest hubs, or hubs in regions that are of personal importance to them, and can sort of lean on those relationships in moments of crisis or miscommunication, and lean on built trust. And so I think that's the ideal, if a situation like that did arise, I think the ideal path forward would be for, whoever was engaging in the national negotiation to talk to someone they have a relationship with in the hub and say, look, we know each other, we trust each other. I have to say, I'm doing this thing. Is there any way you could back off? And maybe the hub says, no, we know what we're doing. We've been engaging in this campaign for longer than you've been in your negotiation. Can you please back off? And that's, something that they would have to figure out using that relationship and trust. So I think that's usually the best recourse. But again, you'd probably have to ask a staff person who's had that specific thing happen.
So Nina, now, so if we look a little bit at where things can go wrong, but can you give us some examples where it really went right, where you would say, look, by virtue of the way we work, we really achieved a success that no one else managed to achieve previously. So can you give us sort of some of these outstanding examples of impact?
Yeah, I can use an example from Ann Arbor, Michigan, actually. Start us off. So about 2 years ago, the Ann Arbor hub of Sunrise launched a campaign to persuade Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, who represents our district in House of Representatives, to co-sponsor the Green New Deal resolution. And, the campaign started off with, meetings with the Congresswoman, sort of informational discussions about what the Green New Deal was. But as time progressed, it escalated towards, nonviolent direct action at her office. And I think even a couple of hub members were arrested in the fall of 2019. And, it was a very tense relationship that the hub held with the Congresswoman for quite some time. Eventually, we had a meeting which diffused some of the tensions, sort of behind closed doors, and credit to the Congresswoman for being willing to engage with us in that setting. And one actual challenge that we had was that, I think it was hard for the Congresswoman, and this is totally understandable, but I think it was hard to grasp who was the key negotiator, whether it was, legislative and policy aides at the national level, or whether it was the people who were planning the mobilizations that the hub was engaging in. And of course, in that setting, it would have been the hub leaders, because the national leaders had nothing to do with the creation of this campaign arc that was manifesting in protests at her office. But that made communication hard, because how was she to know who to talk to in this complicated network of Sunrise Movement leaders? But once that was clarified, I think one of the results of the campaign that we launched was that the Congresswoman became, and I really want to say this not in a way that is appreciative of her, but she became much more receptive to hearing from young constituents who were previously angry, and even said perhaps we should set up a quarterly meeting with the hub and myself to talk about what it is that I'm doing on environment that's working and what's not, and what ideas you guys have. And she also became someone that the national movement was really able to work with in productive ways. She has wonderful and unique relationships to the auto industry and to many labor unions that are really critical to our national work. And, sort of in response, in part in response to the protests that the hub launched at her doors for several months, intermittently, she really, I think, became even more invested in working with the national organization on things like town hall events, or things like the Thrive Agenda, which was a legislative package we felt was in line with the Green New Deal, which we worked with many members of Congress on. She was a key, also helped, work behind the scenes to really think through these questions of how labor, how the auto industry can sort of come together under something like a Green New Deal vision. And so I hope that's a clear explanation. I don't want to go on and on about it, but yeah, it was hard in the beginning, and now she's a really key ally to the movement, in part because this local hub launched this campaign that then.
Yeah. But Nina, what's interesting about your example is that you say, look, we found a supporter of the movement, right? But my real question was, what was the impact outside of the movement and actually moving towards the realization of these objectives of the Green Deal?
Yeah, and I would say, to have Congresswoman Dingell convening conversations with labor unions and auto workers and leaders in those sectors is moving us toward where we need to be, because it's expanding the circle of collaboration in really critical directions.
And what made it happen? What was the critical feature that the Sunrise Movement brought to the table to make that happen? Was it because of the constituents, that they're mainly young people who speak with her in a more constructive way, let's say? Was that a decisive factor? Or was it, let's say, the collaborative approach? What made the difference?
Well, I think it's hard to pinpoint one thing. I think, yes, young people have a unique moral authority, especially when it comes to the climate crisis, that grabs attention, and that certainly helped. And that, I'll speak now not just with regard to the situation with Congressman Dingell, but sort of generally about the movement's impact. So yes, young people's moral authority. Also, I think Sunrise, fundamentally was founded to shape American politics, but it's not a lobbyist organization. The way that Sunrise strives to get elected officials' attention is not through scheduling closed-door meetings with their legislative aides. Not that there's anything wrong with that approach. It is by, protesting outside of their offices, or, specifically calling them out with signs that say their name in big black letters. That show up in the press. And
the point is,
right, it is public.
Yeah,
exactly. And I think, the moral authority young people have actually is part of what makes that strategy work. So these things are really connected. But how easy would it be for young people to get the attention of some of our nation's most powerful political leaders if they weren't engaging in mass mobilization? Maybe not as easy. In the past, it certainly hasn't been. So yeah.
Right. So, but then we can also look at the other side, like what was the biggest failure so far? Right. So you have a success. It worked. It works also because of what you call the moral authority of young people. But on the other hand, on other occasions, I'm sure things did not work out the way it was planned. So could you give an example of that and the underlying reasons?
Yeah. I'm taking a minute to think, not because there's any shortage of failure.
The Sunrise Movement never fails.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say that this is a failure that was recovered from well, but it was one that in my mind, I'm thinking, like, what had the biggest emotional impact on the movement? And this is something that comes to mind. So, Sunrise endorsed Senator Bernie Sanders in the 2020 Democratic presidential primary here in the U.S. And really, the grassroots members of our movement really became invested in, many of them really became invested in that campaign and in its mandate. And when Senator Sanders pulled out of or dropped out of the race, when it came time for him to do that, it was hugely impactful on the whole youth climate movement, I think, here in the U.S. and on Sunrise especially, because we had endorsed him, and because I think it was really hard for people to get excited about campaigning for President Biden after so many months of working to draw the distinction between him and Senator Sanders. And, in the end, Sunrise made, I should know this number off the top of my head, but many, many, many phone calls for President Biden's campaign and worked, I think, pretty constructively with his team to create a platform that we felt better about. And we're now working to co-govern with him, and that's wonderful. But I would say for a long time, the national movement or the national organization was, moving ahead with crafting this better platform and, was sort of processing together as a staff and, figuring out where our next political footsteps should fall. But the grassroots was not quite there yet. The grassroots was like, we are not ready to help that other guy win this election. And they got there eventually, right? But there was a significant disconnect that I think, lost us some time and lost us some trust too, where the grassroots really had a hard time with the fact that the national staff was moving, forward at a pace that maybe wasn't what they would have wanted it to be. And that compromised some trust in the national staff. And I think it also was just difficult. Like, it was difficult for people to come back from. So that would say maybe not a failure, but a drawback.
So the failure, then,
I think definitely.
The failure wasn't picking the wrong candidate, right? Because that's not failure. The failure was, correct me if I'm misunderstanding, the failure was either the organization's framing of the significance of this candidate and the uniqueness of this candidate in being the only vehicle for you to be able to pursue your goals. That's maybe that was true. Or was the failure that reality struck, you have to switch horses, mid-race, and the national team was able to get behind Biden, but failed in its ability to communicate that to the local teams. So what to you, how would you label the failure? What was the failure?
I would say you articulated it well with the second thing you said, the failure to align around the next steps in the wake of disappointment before moving forward. And I touched on that earlier too, of this need to be, by virtue of our structure, this need to be very intentional about how we design, our steps forward.
And you use the word trust. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role that trust plays in your organization?
There's a saying in Sunrise and in many other organizing spaces I've been in, which is, we move at the speed of trust. And I think that's very true. I mentioned this example of, relationships and trust built between local and national organizers to diffuse tension and solve conflict when it arises. But I also think just in day-to-day work, there are so many little ways in which if you trust your collaborators, even if you don't know them on a very personal level, but you trust their intentions. We also have a saying, assume best intentions. You can move much more quickly because, there's less of a need to explain where things are coming from. And, I think that's really good sometimes. And I also think it's good to sort of take a step back and reevaluate and actually work to earn and build trust, work at that instead of just having it sort of there. But yeah, we move at the speed of trust. It's something we say a lot. I think it's very true.
But now, isn't part of the shock in this period that you were on the knife edge between the black deal in the sense of coal and more fossil fuel driven by Trump and his friends, or a green deal? Wasn't part of this emotional shock also the discovery that the Sunrise Movement is not only about an ideological objective, but it's also practically a political move? Wasn't that the realization that sort of set in and that needed to be translated to the grassroots? Like, hey, yes, we have our goals, we have our ideals, but where the rubber meets the road, that's called politics. And these are different things, right? So was that not part of the emotional shock?
I think it may have been. I also think, so Sunrise is, pretty responsive to scholarship and literature, which suggests, or which sort of asks us to think about movements as ecologies, which I think is so interesting. But, to think about different organizations, individuals, even theories of change as distinct organisms that work together in this ecology, make it function so that it can, flourish and achieve its goal. And I think one thing that has arisen over the past year or two, Sunrise was conceptualized 2016, early 2017, really took off in 2018, and has, honestly had a huge impact given how young it is. It's a youth movement. It's a young youth movement. But there have been growing pains with that, and there have been missteps. And I think one thing that we're thinking about now is that the movement ecology for a Green New Deal is populist in one sense, because I think the Green New Deal encompasses so much racial justice work and immigration justice work and gender justice work, and we see it that way. But you're right when you say Sunrise fundamentally is a political organization, and so these other potential facets of the Green New Deal, like mutual aid, and any organizing that exists sort of outside our dominant institutions and instead aims to build alternative institutions. But also even just like social justice organizing that's not, explicitly about climate, even if it is very connected to the climate crisis. Sunrise can't, I don't think Sunrise can hold all of those different pieces of the Green New Deal, which is, for anyone who's familiar with it, it's a very broad and very ambitious set of goals and vision for the future. And so, as that idea has become popularized and as it has become more politically possible, I think there is this sense that, Sunrise cannot be the only movement, the only organization in the movement ecology for a Green New Deal. We need more organizations that are collaborating with Sunrise, as whatever Sunrise next becomes. Maybe it is still very focused on politics, or maybe it's something else. But collaborating with Sunrise on these issues of like, well, what does it look like to fight for Indigenous sovereignty and maybe even this idea of land back under this vision of a Green New Deal, or whatever you want to call it. What does it look like to talk about police reform or defunding the police, or these ideas that have come into the mainstream through the lens of combating the climate crisis, and how do those things work together, and the list goes on and on and on. But the bottom line is that, we need a more populist ecology to meet this moment. And, maybe Sunrise is the political organization, and that's where its expertise should be, or maybe it's somewhere else. But it's probably not big enough, and it probably doesn't have enough expertise to do it all. And so I'm really interested to see how Sunrise will collaborate with other organizations and other demographics of people that isn't just, youth, but is other constituency groups that have a stake in combating the climate crisis in an equitable and just way as we move into this sort of next political era in America, and this next era of dealing with climate disaster as it intensifies.
Right.
Naina. Okay, so it's killing me because we've actually run to our end time, but Paul and I both, we have many, many, many more things we want to ask you. I'm going to call it one question, but it isn't. It's really several. But because you've just raised something that is hugely important, right? You're now talking about the need to collaborate with other organizations. What I'm going to ask you about is, again, on trust. And it's on how you think trust and organizational culture, right? Within the Sunrise movement, how do you build that trust within the movement? What is it that you do intentionally to foster that trust? So that's part one of my single question. And then if we're talking about collaborating with other organizations, of course, the real possibility is that you become competitive in a way with these other organizations because they might not have exactly the same goals, right? So how could you take this sense of trust that you're building, and you're building, by the way, within an organization that has a temporary membership, right? Because people are turning over because you age out of, right? So how do you build it within? And then how could you see building this trust relationship so that your interaction with these other organizations remains collaborative rather than becoming a little bit competitive? Sorry, that really was an unfair number of questions that I'm calling one.
No, you're fine. I will do my best to answer them concisely, and I think they're really good questions. So to your first question, what do you do to build trust individually? I want to paint you guys a picture, actually. Let's go back to summer of 2019, and I was at my first ever Sunrise training in person, and it was the Midwest Summit, so people from all over the Midwest had come to be trained by national trainers. And we were in this movie theater in Detroit, this very retro movie theater. Everyone was sort of sleeping on sleeping bags on the floor and eating, bagels and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for lunch. And, sitting in the movie theater seats and watching slideshows and trainers, training all day. It was hot. And there were big ideas that we were grappling with. And, the movement's executive director was there, our organizing director was there, many of the sort of highest ranking national staff people were there. I had been in the movement for just a couple months. And I remember thinking at that moment in time, there should be more high schoolers here. There should be more teenagers here. And, I was able to just talk to Varshni, our executive director, about that in that moment. I'd never met her before. She, was in town for just a couple days. She had many, many closer friends, certainly than me at that event. But she just sat down and we just talked about it. And I think that is, that kind of gathering where you don't know each other, but you're trusting each other with things like preparing each other's meals, or you're sleeping in the same room as people you don't know because you share values and you're like, well, I trust that this is going to go okay. And I trust that there are systems in place to support me if it doesn't. It's huge for like collectively building trust. And then I think that, that kind of access to the movement's top leaders for someone like me who, had been around for a couple months and had a lot left to learn. Again, this was my first training. Really made me trust the national organization more as a local organizer. This was before I really started nationally holding a national role. So, there's like on the individual level, like those kinds of gatherings and those kinds of practices and that kind of culture, I think really helps build trust, both among local organizers and with national organizers. And then in terms of this idea of like, how do you avoid competing with other organizations in the movement ecology? One thing that's been interesting to see is that as people have aged out of Sunrise, they've joined other, what we call movement adjacent endeavors. So maybe that's like working for a policy think tank that is, helping to push out what the Green New Deal looks like in practice. Or maybe that's working for a polling firm, like, for example, Data for Progress, which does a lot of the polling that Sunrise references as we craft campaign plans or as we write press releases, et cetera. Maybe it's working for a firm like New Deal Strategies, which helps us with our communications, helps to train our spokespeople, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe it's even getting, an academic job where you're studying implementation of ideas in the Green New Deal. Or maybe it's working at a legal practice that's, ready to defend pro bono people who face legal consequences for protesting. Whatever it might be, there are so many movement adjacent roles, and there are also movement organizations where, it's not all about youth, right? Like I've learned so much from Indigenous elders who are on the front lines, and Indigenous water protectors who are much older than me and have so much wisdom to impart. And so sort of like, movement veterans can still be really critical to crafting strategy. And so I think one way of avoiding that sort of competition is to have a movement ecology where the relationships still exist, even if they're no longer within the same organization, but rather across different organizations or, across slightly different, pieces of the movement's broader aim.
So Nina, I'm really impressed at how you speak about the Sunrise Movement with a lot of confidence and poise, and as if you really got the theory fully mastered, right? And that's impressive. So I obviously will challenge to shake that theory a little bit and see, how stable that really is. One issue that comes up through our discussion now is the duality in the movement, as you also sketched that earlier when we spoke about potential conflicts, that you have your grassroots nodes, right? And you also described that as, let's say, with a biological, ecological metaphor, right? We think about the organization as an organic whole, which would imply there's no central ordination. Yet you do have a central master node in Washington. And when we spoke about possible conflicts, it was also between these levels of organization, having different objectives, different understanding, different commitments and responsibilities, right? So that means it's pretty fair then to speak of the organization in these organic terms. I know it sounds nice and it fits very well with the ideas about the Green New Deal, but you could also say, well, actually, it's a very centrally guided political organization who just needs a grassroots to actually exert its political power.
I don't mind the pushback at all. And it's funny, like I have yet to take my first intro to political theory classes in college. That'll come in a couple weeks. But I would say the reason I don't think it is entirely true that it's, a centralized political organization that has a grassroots to back its aims is because the grassroots increasingly, but always has, played a big role in defining the national organization's path forward. And, I think it is clear that if the national organization makes too far a step without consulting the grassroots, it will not have the grassroots to back it anymore. Hubs will change their name and they'll keep organizing for the same principles, same sets of values in their communities without having any affiliation to Sunrise National. And I think Sunrise National is very aware that, they are accountable to this network and there are mutual benefits to being in this relationship together, but they don't have to be. Hubs can organize their communities without Sunrise National's influence. And Sunrise National could be a lobbying organization or have some other, purpose that's not backed by grassroots. But, as of right now, generally, both feel that there's some benefit to being intertwined in the way that they are. But so I do think, there's a sense of accountability to the grassroots that requires consultation and requires that.
Right. Yeah, I get it. That's very good. But now, the other side of the story is also how do we deal with the commons, right? So there is, let's say, the common good in this case, and we speak of ecological common good and avoiding climate catastrophe. On the other hand, we also see many examples around us where this common good is then again instrumentalized by others, as for instance recently was put forward in this Seaspiracy documentary, for instance, on how the organizations that are supposed to certify that fish that's sold in the supermarket is caught in an ecologically sustainable way are actually in cahoots with the fishing industry, and in that sense have instrumentalized that common of ecological, in this case, fishing. So how do you see that for these ecological concerns? So how much of a risk do you see there is for this kind of instrumentalization of this common interest in sustainability and avoidance of climate collapse?
Can you restate the risk you are referring to?
Well, I can start any movement and collect money and say, "Oh, we're going to save the planet. Please give me all your money. I'm going to save the planet." Now I have instrumentalized the commons, and as long as I'm a slick communicator, I'm sure I'm going to be successful with it.
Right. So you're asking, like, what's ensuring that this, use of resources is efficient, accountable, and doing what it says it's going to do?
Well, you are competing as the Sunrise Movement, you could argue. You have an ideological objective. You have different mechanisms in place to assure that you adhere to these ideals in a proper and ethical way. However, you might have competing organizations in that same space who have instrumentalized that commons for, let's say, personal gain. Right? So do you see that development as a risk of the current interest that people have in our society in realizing something like a Green Deal? Even the oil industry is jumping on it, right? We're green.
Right.
Okay? So how do you deal with that risk?
Greenwashing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think part of it is drawing a distinction, like what lies within the movement ecology and what does not. And I think if you ask most Sunrisers, they would say, something like a company like Exxon or Shell is not, in the movement ecology in the sense of like working towards the same goal. Even if they may say that they are. And there are definitely people who would disagree with that, like people outside of Sunrise, maybe even some people in Sunrise, who would say, well, if they want to join us, let them join us. And that's, an ideological debate that people can have among themselves. But drawing the distinction, between who is our teammate and who's not, is one thing. And then I think for the second piece of within the movement, I am of the belief that most of the organizations within the movement, if they are successful, if they have an engaged base, it's because they're offering something. And maybe with a more established, sort of big green organization, that something is lending credibility to younger activist ideas, or it's, having access to particular political leaders who might not, meet with younger activists, but that there's something that each organization can bring to the others, even if they are competitors, or even if one has more financial resources than the others. I don't know if I'm quite getting at your question though, but yeah, I would say recognizing the particular thing that each organization can offer to the others, and then taking advantage of that as a broader movement. Well, feel free to ask follow-up if I haven't quite gotten there.
Well, maybe to sharpen it, I can change it also a little bit. Like, for instance, you could say, well, we have to go for solar power. However, in the meantime, we also know that China is the main supplier of the components that we need to largely deploy solar power systems. So that would mean, as the more you push for your Green Deal, the more, in some sense, you also support, in that sense, a country and an economy that's not necessarily adhering to all your values, right? So how do you deal with these kinds of potential conflicts in the ideological objectives that you have?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of inter-movement dialogue. I think it's a lot of recognition that the systems that we operate under are actually pretty far from being aligned with the values that our members hold. And so that requires our members to be in conversation with each other all the time about, what is the least harmful or most promising path forward given the constraints of the world we live in and the systems under which it operates. And there is no, I mean, at least to my mind, there is no right answer. There's no way out of those ideological dilemmas. But we can move forward in ways that more people feel good about, or that more minds have sort of thought about and thought of as sound if we talk to each other.
Now, so you have that communication here, which I understand. Now, to finish it up, I have two questions for you. So I think I can guess the answer to the first one, but I'm not going to say it. So do you believe that human on this planet, on the global scale, will be able to develop and maintain sustainable collaboration?
I think, do I believe we will? I don't know if I can say with confidence that we will, but do I believe we can? I definitely think we can.
Okay. And we will? You're not convinced whether we will? You're not sure about that?
I'm not sure, but
okay.
I definitely think we can.
But then the last question is, if I give you a magic wand, right, and you can change anything you want about humans, right, their genome, their metabolome, their brain, anything you want, what's the one thing you would change in order that they will be able to collaborate?
I wish I had more eloquent terminology to refer to this, but I think I would make it so that they're not operating from a scarcity mindset, and instead, have faith in abundance. And because I just think that, both in a movement context where it's like, oh, there's only so much recognition, success, and credit that can be distributed among the movement's organizations, that creates competition and hinders collaboration between organizations, between people, whatever. But also at the much bigger scale, in places like Appalachia, like Bihar, where my family's from, it's like, when flooding comes, when fire strikes, are people going to come together across socioeconomic divides, race divides, gender divides, whatever, and help each other out and trust that there can be enough food, enough clean water, enough clean air, enough space, enough shelter for everyone to thrive if they lean on each other? Or are people going to close themselves off, divide along these lines of race, class, gender, whatever, and try to protect what's theirs and not help their neighbors, both at the neighborhood level, but also at the international level, right? Like our country's going to help. So that's what I would change. Is I would make it, and of course that requires systems change too, but make it so that instead of operating from a place of scarcity, we're operating from a place of abundance.
Very good. Naina Agrawal-Hardin, thank you very much for this conversation.
Hi, you listened to one of our podcasts in the series on collaboration, produced by the Instrument Forum and the Convergent Science Network. You can find more episodes on our website.